welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin.
And I'm Justin Clark.
And today we're discussing the future of food. And I just want to open up this episode with a quote. It's by Bill Gates. And he said, "What I just tasted is not just a clever meat substitute. What I just tasted was the future of food." And that was when he tried the first faux chicken dish by Beyond Meat, the
Beyond
company.
Meats, yeah.
So we're going to get all into these companies that are creating lab-grown meat and creating a lot of good in the world as a side effect, or maybe as part of their core mission. Mm. But before that, I want to talk more generally about three main areas which we'll cover on today's episode. So I want to talk about the future of food as it's related to health. So what is actually healthy for us to be eating, not taking anything else into consideration. The environment. So if we're just optimizing for the environment, what's the best way that we can eat, and how can new technologies allow us to do this? And morality. So how can we minimize suffering and maximize happiness, and what does that mean for the food industries, factory farms, all of those sorts of things? So starting off with health, first I want to just get Justin's take on this. So how do you view food? Do you take some of these environmental, moral implications into the food that you eat? And also, what have you found to be a healthy way of eating and a healthy way of consuming food for you?
Yeah, so I try to consider as much as possible when eating my food. I'm actually one of those people that's really nitpicky about what he eats. So I like to eat, because I'm not a vegan and I'm not really dogmatic in terms of any particular type of diet, but I do eat meat and I try to eat real food, and that's basically it. Try to stray away.
And what do you mean by real food?
So anything that might have had cells, like living cells, in the past several weeks, for example. So processed food like crackers, definitely weren't any living cells in those crackers for a very long time, and they've gone through a lot of stages before they have been processed. And that's just kind of a rule of thumb. That's not necessarily like a sort of health or guaranteed health guideline, but I find it to be a good way to eat real food and stray as far away as possible from the standard American diet, which is very proven to be a terrible diet for basically anybody. But yeah, I mean, when I'm eating meat, I like to eat grass-fed meat, or if I can get a hold of venison that was hunted by, a deer that lived a full life out in the wild, that's ideal. To have some meat that had a life, that wasn't crammed up against some other cows or some other animal, basically eating other animals' feces because it doesn't have enough space to even walk. Right. It's just really disgusting what some of the factory farms do these days. But anyways, long story short, I just try to stray away from that as much as possible. But in terms of what I think is healthy, that's a hard question. I think there's so many diets that are the complete opposite of one another that seem to work for a lot of people. So for example, if you move from a standard American diet to a vegan diet, you're almost 100% guaranteed to feel 1,000% better. It's unreal how much of a benefit you can have by going from standard American to vegan. Now, is vegan the most healthy diet? There's a lot of science that says, no, you probably need a lot more nutrients that aren't available in real food in a vegan diet. So sure, you can have a vegan diet where you're supplementing very heavily, but it would be easier to just, eat meat every once in a while, or like a liver, or, shrimp, some sort of seafood. It's not that hard.
Yeah. Well, I want to push back on that a little bit, because I tried going vegetarian for about 9 months, almost a year, and I was close to vegan. I wasn't totally vegan because I did still have Greek yogurt sometimes. But And initially, I did feel good. I felt like I was more alert and I felt like I could get a lot of work done. I noticed that I had to snack a lot more throughout the day. A meal wouldn't tide me over for as long. But over the months, over the many months of doing this, by the end of the 9 months, I had lost a lot of weight and I got really sick. And
Hmm.
after my sickness, my mom was like, just, eat a burger or and so I ate some meat and I felt immediately better. And
Uh-huh.
I think for my own body, I have found that meat is something that's, I mean, maybe I didn't eat the proper vegan diet. Maybe I didn't have as
Yeah.
many of the different nutrients, and that's probably true. But for my own self, I would like to be vegetarian or vegan from a moral standpoint and an environmental standpoint. But what
Hmm.
I've found for myself is that it's not what makes me feel the healthiest.
Yeah. And what's kind of uh, so it's a little backwards, some of the moral arguments for veganism, because if you're a vegan and you're eating, I mean, there's factory farming for plants. It's not just for um, meat or any sort of uh, livestock. But if you're a vegan and you eat anything wheat based or corn based, you're one piece of corn. There's definitely dead mammals like ground nesting birds. You've got chipmunks, gophers, all of these little animals that are living in a field. Those are getting killed by the tractors that come and try to grate up all of this stuff and process the corn or the wheat. And I think there's just a disconnect between the fact that you're eating the thing that's dead. You're eating a piece of meat. That seems less moral than eating a whole bunch of plants, which might be responsible for just as much death. Now, again, I think it's still better morally to eat a vegan diet, but it's not necessarily like the ideal moral diet. The ideal
Right.
moral diet is there's no death, no suffering. So you could bring in a totally other aspect of food and think about how you can grow food more or grow plants more ethically, not just how can we grow meats more ethically.
Right. Well, I want to stay on health first, and there's certainly a lot that I have to say about the moral implications as well. But
Hmm.
as far as what we think to be healthy, you mentioned the typical American diet, and I feel like the typical American diet is still very much the food pyramid that we saw in
Oh
elementary
gosh.
school, which is funny because it's almost like you could invert that pyramid, and it would be more accurate than the way the pyramid currently is. I feel like
Yeah.
that with that pyramid, it was more just describing what people do eat versus what
Yeah.
they should eat, because
Yeah.
it's not like you should just mostly have grains and then like just have a little bit of like proteins and like a little bit of veggies. I mean, certainly they both got the sugar is bad part right.
Hmm.
um, and then there's so as far as what your diet is, I think what you were saying earlier is spot on, where that it's really about the person. Certain diets work for certain people. um,
And it
uh,
depends on what your goal is.
yeah.
So do you want to build muscle or do you want to be an endurance athlete or do you just want to have a healthy functioning brain and body? It depends.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, yeah. I mean, as a guy who does a lot of athletics, I've tried to eat as much protein and veggies as I can, and I try to keep grains to a minimum. I keep dairy to a minimum, although I really like yogurt, and lots of fruits as well. And I think that's pretty good for athletic males, as much as you can say anything generally. But for my wife, for instance, she has a lot more dairies and a lot
Hmm.
more fatty foods, and I feel like for her body that makes more sense, and it actually is a good diet for her. And then my sister is a vegan, and she has incredible endurance and can do incredible things in yoga and seems to be healthy. So I think for her
Hmm.
veganism does work.
Yeah. And so I have a lot of issues with the way science about diets is being done, because you have all of these people that are purporting these next big diets that are going to solve everything. But a lot of studies related to nutrition is done in either healthy or unhealthy white males. Like it's not a very diverse
Hmm.
group. And I know it's changing more now, but all the science that we hear about now has been in the literature for a very long time. Like we haven't learned anything new that's mainstream for, maybe 5, 10 years. I know there's, some people on the cutting edge, but there's not that much new stuff that wasn't known a while ago, except for maybe the ketogenic diet or something.
Right. Yeah, I feel like the best practice is to pretty much become your own scientist with your own body. And
Hmm.
that's one thing that any nutritionist will tell you. I mean, they told my sister, when my sister had some stomach problems, they had her basically write down the foods she was eating for each
Hmm.
meal and how she felt after each meal. And by doing this for several weeks, she figured out, oh, these certain foods do not make me feel good. These certain foods are okay. So maybe cheese is good for you, whereas maybe it upsets someone else's stomach.
Hmm.
And then another tip that I've heard from Scott Adams, he says that once you figure out what is healthy food for you, the best thing you can do is to make it as convenient as possible. So if you're lazy, you're on the couch watching TV, and you open up the fridge and you have some carrots in ranch or some apples and peanut butter, and you don't have any granola bars, which are basically glorified candy bars or anything like
Yep.
that, then you're going to be healthier because that's a better system.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's crazy too that we have giant companies like Coca-Cola being one of the biggest brands in the US, probably the world. And it's probably one of the companies that's causing the most harm when it comes to health.
It's terrible. Yeah.
It really makes me sick that, something so bad for the general public is so glorified.
Yeah. And it's just because they have such good branding and marketing.
Yeah, I mean they do have awesome marketing, but it's that's
Yeah.
just one of those cases of incentives not being aligned. Like if the incentive was for companies to create the best and the healthiest products, then they would. If
Yeah.
that's how the incentives lined up.
Well, that reminds me of the famous Steve Jobs quote when he was going to hire the new president of Apple, right before he got ousted. And it was I forget his name, but he was the CEO of Pepsi at the time. And the guy was like, well, I don't know. I make so much money at Pepsi. I got this really, really cushy bonus structure. I don't know. And then Steve Jobs just looks at him with his famous glare and he says, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life or do you want to change the world? And I love that because
Yeah,
just like you said, the incentive structure is so backwards. It's like our society values someone pushing sugar water to billions of people every day instead of helping the planet through renewable energy or finding ways to create better farming practices that lead to better
yeah,
well-being of animals.
yeah, dude. I mean, there's some good things too, though. I mean, there's definitely a push to people realizing, oh wait, sugar's probably not that good. We
Yeah.
should probably do something
And I
about it.
kind of feel like it's the same thing as, like I have the same stance on sugar as I do on cigarettes or on lottery tickets, which is
Hmm.
that for some people, if you're having a stressful day and you need to go get a cupcake at Sprinkles, or if you need to go, have a cigarette, or if playing the lottery takes the stress off of your day, like that's fine. I'm not like who am I to tell you that you shouldn't be doing that? It's really
Hmm.
just when you do it in excess that can
Right.
can really be bad for you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard where to figure out where to draw the line there. Like when do you, as a government, for example, intervene on somebody making all the wrong choices when it comes to health?
Yeah.
If a government is in charge of healthcare, it's in their best interest to not let citizens get out of hand in terms of
Right.
their
Well,
health.
I mean, now people pay higher premiums if they lead unhealthy lifestyles. So
Yeah.
there is, but it's mostly for cigarette smokers. I mean, that even under Obamacare, which protects pre-existing conditions, the one thing it does not protect is whether or not you're a smoker. But it would be
Interesting.
better if it extended even further, where if you made all of the best health decisions, you would get better
Hmm.
premiums. And I mean, it's a tough situation because you could also make the case for universal health care, which I'm a proponent of in general. But
Yeah. As long as it's done correctly. I mean, there's a lot of ways
yeah,
to mess up universal health care.
right. And then the final other thing I want to just mention as it relates to health with food is the fear or the risk of antibiotic fed
Oh,
animals
yeah.
creating superbugs potentially, because you hear a lot about this. So on the animal side, you're basically having them in these horrible conditions. I mean, one thing, if as a metaphor, it would be like if you lived your entire life in an elevator with nine other people. And that's not an exaggeration. That is literally what it would be like. And you don't really have bathrooms either. You have, some slits in the ground. But
Yeah.
imagine what that life would be like. And then imagine the solution is just getting chocked full of antibiotics constantly. That is the perfect festering ground for some superbug to come out of nowhere. And we've had some of them. We've had mad cow, we've had
Mm.
the bird flu, but they've all been relatively controlled. But there,
Because we've had strong enough antibiotics.
right, but there's no reason to think that that'll go on forever. And then on the vegetable and grain side, my mom's a gardener, and so she's all about organic farm to table stuff. She always talks about how horrible the companies like Monsanto are, where
Oh, yeah.
they give you genetically engineered grains and vegetables.
Fertilizers.
Yeah, and basically these are not able to reproduce. So the typical way that, as my mom would say, God intended, is that you have these seeds and then they grow to be plants and they germinate more seeds, and it's the cycle of life. But with these genetically engineered seeds, they create plants, but then they can no longer germinate. And it creates a competitive advantage for companies like Monsanto because they have to keep buying the seeds from them.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a disgusting business model.
yeah,
Similar to like opioids. It's almost like somebody is making opioids on purpose just to make money at the cost of society.
totally. And that's why you see these high-end vegetables like such as heirloom tomatoes, or in Mexico the blue corn tortilla chips, because these are seeds and plants that have come from the very beginnings of planet Earth,
Hmm.
and they've come all the way down till now, and they haven't been messed with. So I think it's going to be really important for our own health to make sure that we continue with the natural way of doing things, because
Yeah.
that's our best bet against any sort of biological
Yeah.
diseases.
It's almost always a bad idea to go against the system that was put in place by whatever you want to call it, Mother Nature, God, some sort of, whatever biology has created and evolution has created. You should probably not try to stray away from that too much.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
humans are pretty
how many Greek
adaptive.
tragedies have to be written before we realize that hubris is going to be our downfall, and we can't play God and expect everything to turn out better than if we had left what is God's to God.
Yeah, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
That's hard.
So, anyways, let's go on to the second topic. So, that's health as far as the future of food is concerned. Now, let's talk about the environment. So,
Okay.
obviously, there is massive pollution created from the process of growing food, specifically growing meat, because there's basically
Oh,
a 10 to 1 energy loss. So, for every calorie of corn that you give a cow or whatever, or sorry, for every 10 calories of vegetable, it can only create 1 calorie of meat. So there's
Yeah.
enormous law and energy loss, and that same loss is, I think, from. I mean, it's even worse for animals like cows. I think the best ones are
Yeah.
like chickens.
I think goats are, maybe it's not goats. Chickens I know are really good.
Yeah, and then all the things that you consider. It's not just growing the animals and feeding them throughout their life. It's also the methane that they produce and other, so basically from cows burping and farting, they create so much methane that if they were a country, they would be the third largest methane producing country in the world.
Oh my
That's how
gosh.
many
Yeah.
cows there are. And I think there's something like a billion chickens killed every year. It's insane. So, I mean, just the scale of how much pollution is being created by these animals and also by transporting them, by preserving them,
Yeah.
shipping them on big steamliners, refrigerating them at the grocery store. There's so much being done to the environment that we have to we have to seriously consider how do we plan to feed 10 billion people by the year 2050, because that's the number we're looking at.
Yeah. And one of the things that also gets overlooked when it comes to the waste of, you know, raising meat or even just regular factory farming of vegetables. You waste something like, I think farms waste about or use about 70% of annual fresh water usage on, all of their various
Oh yeah.
things. It's a huge percentage. And a lot of it is just wasted because there's not a good way to, for example, target, some plants need more water than others. And this is becoming a little bit better now with precision farming. So you have these drones that can kind of tell which plants need to get a little more water. So they'll go and like they'll go precisely put the amount of water that this specific plant needs, or this amount of fertilizer. The fertilizer thing is that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we could go down, but that's definitely not good for the environment.
Yeah,
With
I
like
remember
Roundup.
in the California water drought, all the price of almonds went way up because apparently almonds take so much water to grow, and avocados are another big
Mhm.
consumer of water.
Yeah, it's really hard out there too because there's no rain and it's so dry.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think people don't realize is that there are huge subsidies that the government has in place for farmers. I mean, you hear so much on any campaign trail about how we need to protect our farmers. We got to get farmers. There's always these emotional propositions that are put on that will help farmers, and that doesn't take into consideration the fact that there's probably more people who worked at Sears before it got shut down than actual farmers nowadays. So it's more of just like a harkening back to the good old days kind of
Hmm.
persuasion tactic. But the U.S. government gives $38 billion in subsidies to the farming industry each year. So on top of the actual costs and pollution that's coming out of this, there's a lot of money going into it as well.
Yeah,
And
that's always a bad bad way to create misincentives or misaligned incentives.
totally. And as far as how much greenhouse gases are created, so people tend to think of cars and power plants as the main producers of pollution, but factory farming actually causes more greenhouse gas emissions than all cars, trains, planes, boats, and any other
Wow,
modes of transportation combined.
that's crazy. It doesn't help that creating all this farmland is cutting down forests and
Right.
using up a huge percentage of usable land mass or land area. It's
Totally.
it's a really terrible cycle. It's almost a snowball that it's going to be hard to slow down or stop unless we do something relatively soon. And the other thing with these fertilizers is and these Monsanto super engineered plants is they leach all the nutrients out of the soil, and the soil over time loses its fertility. So 50 years from now, most of our farmland, or maybe not most, but a decent chunk of farmland might not even be usable for farmland anymore because all the nutrients are gone. So unless some sort of preservation tactic is taken, we're going to lose even our farmland because of the tactics that are currently used by some farmers.
Yeah. And, climate change is also going to make a lot of farmland not usable also going forward. Like,
Yeah,
I think
and
I
and
read that.
if you think of the climate change as just more, so a lot of people think of climate change as like it getting warmer or cooler, but what a lot of people overlook is the fact that it creates and this is what I think you were getting at, is it creates these superstorms. Like if you think of a probability distribution of the probability that some superstorm, hurricane, typhoon, all these things take place, the climate changing in the way that everyone says climate change, it can shift over that probability on the tails, like the far tails, just a little bit, increasing the chances of category 5 hurricanes by double.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. I could go down a rabbit hole on
Right.
climate change too, but
And all this is happening while not only is the population of the world expanding exponentially, so I said earlier, we're projected to have 10 billion people by the year 2050, which is a huge increase from 7 billion people now, when you think about just the percentage scale of that. And not only are there going to be an additional however many billion people by then, they also, the quality of living is improving, which is generally a good thing. People, there are more people who are able to own a car and to have electricity, have running water, start eating more meat. People, think about all the people in Asia who traditionally have just lived on rice. Now they're going to be able to eat, more chicken and add pork and fish to their diet. And all of this is good on an individual level. But when you tally it all up, it means a lot more pollution and a lot more suffering for the animals. So I want to get into a little bit more of morality, and then after that we should talk about what some of the solutions are, which I think to a large extent are going to be forward-thinking companies like Memphis Meats and Beyond Meat. So as far as the morality, I think one thing that people get wrong all the time is we treat animal suffering or animal conscious experiences as this unknowable, nebulous phenomenon
yeah,
that when really it's like, oh, how do I know that my dog loves me? You just know it. I mean, you look at
yeah,
it's like it's not a mystery that animals can feel the same things that we do. And the other thing to consider is that our brains evolved from the same exact ancestors that all of the animals have evolved from. Our nervous systems are pretty much identical as far as their component parts. It's just the way that they're constructed that's different. And if you have a mouse and you electrocute it every time it comes out of its hole, guess what? It's going to have an anxiety disorder. And then if you give that mouse Xanax, it's going to chill out and it's going to come out of its hole and explore. That's why we test mice for drugs first to see if they work on humans. It's precisely because our biology is so similar.
yeah. And it's especially similar to mice in a lot of cases.
Right. So I think the question is not even a valid question of, can animals experience suffering? Do they really have empathy for one another? Are they really, do they want to live? So,
That's almost like asking. That's like saying, "Oh, does this person over here experience pain?" Of course
yeah,
they do. Like they're living. Just because you aren't them and you can't feel exactly how they feel doesn't mean that they can't feel joy, happiness, pain, suffering. I think it's basically a synonymous question.
Yeah. I mean, I watched this video on Instagram the other day that was this cow who was playing in a field, and the owner, or I don't know if it was the owner, but some person had this bouncy ball, like size of a soccer ball, and was throwing it, and the cow was galloping after it and bringing it back to the human in the very same way that a dog would play fetch. And yet we kill all of these cows every year, slaughter them in these incredibly inhumane ways. Same thing with pigs. A lot of people have pet pigs, including Ariana Grande and other, but we still kill these pigs. And another stat that was just amazing to me is that the average amount of surface area that a hen has to lay eggs is smaller than the surface area of a sheet of paper. It's like a little more than 2/3 the size of a standard 8.5 by 11 piece of printer paper for its entire life. That's not
For the
even
factory farm chickens,
that's
you
the
mean?
industry standard in factory
Wow.
farms. That's like if you go to if you go to Walmart or whatever and you buy some chicken breast and you're like, oh, $5, nice. That's what you're eating.
Yeah. This chicken that's lived a super anxious life, filled with antibiotics, filled with adrenaline. It just, the composition of the meat is different when it's coming from someone that was given steroids to build its muscle, because it doesn't actually build the muscle naturally, because it doesn't have enough room to do anything to build muscle.
Right.
It's just kind of gross how the whole industry works.
It is, and the rule of thumb that I use for my own, because I'm a meat eater, so a lot of this sounds hypocritical where I'm talking against meat, but my own personal rule is that if an animal has more happiness than suffering in its own life, then I think that animal's life was worth living.
Mm-hmm.
But for most factory farm animals, they certainly experience more suffering than happiness.
Is there any happiness? I mean,
Well, so, I mean, look, there are some really good farms out there. I mean, Kobe beef and what, like there are.
oh yeah.
They
Just
do
in factory
exist,
farms,
but I'm
I
just
mean.
saying the vast majority are not, and that's why personally, I don't care where the meat is from. I will not eat lamb or veal, no matter what, because the specific practices of lamb and veal is they want it to be as tender as possible, so they even go the extra mile to limit their movements, and they kill them before they even achieve adulthood, which I think is just really robbing them of a lot
Yeah, I
of
didn't
their.
know that. I knew that about veal. I didn't
Yeah,
realize
lamb
that
is
about.
meant to be really tender, and it's a lot of the same practices, and they're killed at about the same age as veal. So I'll never eat either of those unless maybe there is some farm that does it really well, and I know it's from that farm. Even then, I think it's just not cool to kill an
Yeah.
adolescent, like, and like most of the cows that they have that they get milk from, it's pretty terrible because they're not they have the cows, they like keep their kids near the cow, and that will make it produce more milk, but then they take them away so that they aren't like distracted from producing milk. And it's like, I mean, imagine a human parallel of that where it's like you have kids, you're all excited, and then your kids get taken from you and you're never able to see them, and you're just in this gestation bin where all you can do is just get like pumped out of I mean, it's
It's so
horrible.
messed up.
So I want to get to now what the solution is. I think we've talked enough about how terrible it is, and anyone can watch Food Inc. or any of the number of documentaries that talk about how terrible it is, and I think most people realize how horrible factory farm animals are treated.
And I will reiterate that it's not just meat, it is vegetables as well. Vegetables are not produced very ethically. I mean, it's not directly killing something for its meat, but it's killing a lot of things as a byproduct of creating these vegetables.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk about how we'll actually solve this problem.
Yeah, so the company that is most impressive and interesting to me is Memphis Meats. And I
Same.
originally learned about this company from Steve Jurvetson, who's a venture capitalist, and he invested in SpaceX and Tesla and Facebook and all sorts of amazing startups. And this is one of his more recent investments. And Memphis Meats actually started off as a company that would basically, I don't know if you would call it 3D print, but they would basically create an organ for you as a replacement. So let's say you have a liver disease and you know you're going to need a liver replacement. Rather than waiting for someone who has the same blood type as you to be willing to donate and all of that, or a relative or whatever, you can actually use your exact DNA to grow an exact replica of your liver, which your body will have a much higher chance of taking and incorporating it into your body than it would if you just took it from some other person. Also, you don't have to create the suffering of that other person if they're alive. I mean, if they're dead and an organ donor, I guess it's a different question. But anyways, this is how the company started. But then they realized, well, this is actually a much more difficult problem than the problem of growing meat for consumption in the form of food. Mm-hmm. Because when you're creating a liver specifically for your body, you don't have a whole lot of margin for error. But when you're creating a steak, even if it's not exactly identical to the cow that it came from, it's still going to be, delicious steak. It's going to not have any animal suffering involved at all. It's not going to be needed to be transported anywhere, and it's not going to have any of the chemical side effects of being slaughtered or antibiotics. So I thought this was brilliant, and some people are very skeptical. They call it Franken meat or lab grown meat, but the people who are who like the idea call it clean meat, because that's really what it is. It's clean from all of the other horrible things that most meat come along with.
Yeah, and so I would consider myself among one of the people who probably I wouldn't go as far as saying I'm a skeptic, but I would say that I probably won't be an early adopter of eating their meat, like on a regular basis. I mean, I'd try it. It's not like it's going to kill you. But since there's so little research about what is actually nutritious in food, I would want to see some sort of longer term studies on people eating these meats. Is there a difference in the meat you eat that didn't actually live a full life? Is there some sort of energy that you can, this might sound a little crazy, but is there something that we can't quantify yet that we get when we eat something that was living? But I mean, this might just be like eating processed meat, like a cracker instead of wheat that just came out of rice that just came out of the rice field.
Yeah, so, maybe. Although I think it has to the downsides of whatever not having that living element in the meat have to be outweighed by the plus sides, which are the antibiotics, there's a lot of other things to consider, and I don't know. That's an interesting question, and it definitely is going to take a little bit of time for people to come around to the idea and start eating it. I think really what's going to be the big kicker is once it is economically more viable than the traditional way of consuming meat.
Yeah, so, factory farming.
Yeah, so when it's cheaper to get clean meat that was grown in a lab, that you can just have a couple steaks growing in your garage, and then you just go back there, you get a steak. You didn't have to pay for any of the or whatever. I think at that point it's going to become the rule rather than the exception.
Oh yeah, and I wasn't trying to say that this would be better than I wasn't saying that this would be worse than factory farmed meat. I just didn't know if it would be the same as like a
Kobe
hunted,
beef
yeah, the
yeah,
top
or
of the line beef.
wild
So
Alaskan salmon or whatever.
there's no doubt that this would have a much more positive moral component to it.
Yeah.
Like you're doing good by one, not eating the animal that would have been, lived a terrible life. You're not contributing to that. And two, you're probably going to escape all of the antibiotics and all of the negatives that you get from factory farmed meat. And as a side effect, probably contribute to not creating a superbug, not contribute to all of the endless suffering that happens in factory farming. There's a lot of side effects that you don't see that are very positive to the whole world.
And I always just go back to my same rule, which is if the animal is living a happier life, a life that has more happiness than sadness, then that's a good thing. Or if it's more sadness than happiness, then that's a bad thing. And I think what we're seeing in the world right now are a ton, billions of chickens, billions of cows, billions of pigs around the world who are having a worse life than whatever the baseline level would be for even, suffering and happiness. And I think what we might see in the next 50 years when we transition into clean meat is we see a much smaller number of animals. So there's only going to be, a couple handfuls of cows, chickens, pigs, but those animals are going to live incredibly great lives, because if they swab these animals' DNA to use for clean meat, they have an incentive to have the happiest possible cows that only have, like, think about Kobe beef, but even better. Like, they're getting massaged, they're roaming in the fields, they're listening to Beethoven.
eating all the best grass.
Yeah, because we have an incentive to keep these animals around so that we're at least still swabbing DNA of real cows that go through nature in the same way that we were talking about at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah.
But I have a fun time thinking about these cows who are just living the life 50 years from now. And when they're not even, maybe we lab grow their milk too, and, they're just basically frolicking in the fields and caring for their own and doing everything that any animal on this earth loves to do. I don't care if you're a human or a pig or a pterodactyl or whatever.
Yeah, dude. Have you heard of that company or the farm in, I think it's Virginia, just a little bit south of Washington, D.C.? I'm blanking on the name. Oh, Polyface Farms.
No, I haven't heard of it.
So this is it's not lab-grown meat, but it's about the most ethical farming practice that you can possibly imagine. Not too far behind, the massaging and Beethoven for cattle. But this farm, the farmer is a genius. He's still around. And he created this system, like this little ecosystem in his farm. So basically, he moves his cattle every day. So if they have this little, let's say 10-acre parcel where they can roam and eat all the grass one day, the very next day they'll move to an adjacent parcel with the very best grass, like very tall and really healthy grass. And every single day he'll move it to this new parcel, and let's say he has 100 of these parcels in the farm. 4 days behind when the cattle are roaming, chickens come around in those exact same parcels. So they eat all of the maggots and everything in the feces of the cattle and basically clean up.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about that is they're kind of the end hosts. I forgot exactly what the term is, but basically most bacteria, especially E. coli and other important things that we need to make sure cows don't have, the chickens are basically the end zone for that, and they can't get past the chickens. The chickens just kind of digest all of that and clean up all the waste of the cattle. And then as a byproduct, they create eggs, very healthy eggs, because the chicken are eating exactly what they need to be eating.
Right.
So it's just creating this system. And I think even behind the chicken, he has turkeys, which clean up everything that the chickens did. And then it's just this never-ending cycle where the grass is always super green. So if you think of an S curve on like in each of the parcels where the grass is, if the cows eat it, it goes down to the very bottom. But then if you let the grass grow for too long, it kind of gets old and tapers off.
Yeah.
But he aims to make sure that the cows eat all the grass kind of in the adolescent of the grass, in the grass's lifetime. So it's like the healthiest and has all of the nutrients. And he said there's like 20 different species of grass, which is insanely positive and good for these cattle. It was just a really cool video that I saw him like walk through his practice.
See, that's great. I mean, getting more creative around how we grow our meat is the way to go. We can certainly get more creative than just putting a chicken in the smallest possible box and not expecting anything bad to happen as a result of that. So I think as we go forward into the future of food, I think what we are going to see is certainly in the more high-end rungs of society, we're going to see things like Kobe beef, things like the farm that you just mentioned. What was the name of that?
Polyface Farms.
Polyface Farms. And then I think for the mass market, so for people who are just earning enough money to start consuming meat on a regular basis, I believe we are going to see clean meat grown in a lab as the big solution there. And hopefully all of this is going to result in better conscious experiences for the greatest number of conscious beings, and a healthier diet for everyone, and lower environmental impact as we're at this critical juncture where all of these are really coming to a head with population growth and rising incomes and everything like that.
Yeah, what do you think about these vertical farms where they're kind of moving these plant growing farms inside maybe a warehouse in the middle of Brooklyn?
I think that's great. I think getting anytime you can minimize the transportation gap where you can just grow something in your backyard, I think that's always a good idea.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to the climate change thing you were talking about, where we have all of these extreme environmental events that basically wipe out some farmland. Let's say down in southeastern Asia, and where there's a lot of things being grown. But if there's a big typhoon, it can wipe out a lot of stuff for a while.
Yeah, and well, not only that, and with global warming, huge areas within Africa specifically are going to no longer be farmable at all. And a lot of these cultures have done nothing but farm for as long as their tradition has lasted. So we're going to need to rethink the role of farming and how farming is done and how we can minimize transportation, minimize suffering, maximize the amount of production that is healthy and can feed people. So I actually feel pretty good about where this trend is heading. I mean, I noticed in California just in the last couple of years, we've had some really great ballot measures where it's increased the amount of space that animals have had. It's created better environments for these animals to live, and they were voted into law by an overwhelming majority. So I think people really do care about this issue, and I think tech and governments are also stepping up to start to take this on. So I would just urge anyone listening to be someone who always is advocating for the well-being of animals, whether you're a vegetarian or vegan or not. I think that's another common issue, is that people are like, oh, well, I eat meat, so I don't give a shit. But you don't have to be completely one side or the other. You can be someone who eats meat who just wants animals to live happier lives than they are.
Yeah.
So.
You hear a lot of people, that reminded me of people having a negative view of hunters. I mean, I've never been hunting, but I know a lot of hunters that actually work really hard for the meat, and they don't eat meat otherwise. They work hard to eat something that grew up in the wild.
Yeah.
And I think there's just like this weird movie caricature of what hunters are. You know,
Well,
what you
I
see
mean,
in
I
the
think
movies.
trophy hunters are pretty despicable.
Yeah, it's pretty
especially
gross
if it's an
in a lot of
endangered
cases.
animal like a lion or an elephant or a giraffe, like, Donald Trump's
Yeah.
sons. But
So that kind of brings up something though, because we could have a whole separate podcast of this, like the future of conservation or something.
uh-huh.
But basically, some of these tribes in Africa, that's the only way they make money. Let's say elephant hunting is taking a rich white dude on an elephant hunt. That maybe is $1 million extra in their account, like in their village. Now, if they don't have hunting, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to start hunting and selling the ivory. So it's a very fine edge. Like it's not a black or white scenario. And I think, I don't want to sit here and advocate for trophy hunting because I think just absolutely it's kind of a disgusting thing that people want to do it. But in the environment we're in today, it's not necessarily the worst thing because the alternative is people are going to the tribes that are leading these hunts for lions or elephants are going to then go and kill everything because those animals now hold no value, and instead they're trampling, all of the farmland or anything else because they are
Yeah.
relatively destructive creatures.
Well, I mean, frankly, I feel like these hunters need to learn to code or learn to play music or do something else. Like, I mean, I get it. It's in their tradition for a long time, but who's advocating for the elephants? I mean,
Yeah.
we've,
I mean,
Lord knows
I
we've
would love
destroyed
for them.
so many of them already. And these are majestic creatures that have bigger brains than we do and communicate emotionally in ways that we can't comprehend. So, I agree. People need to speak out for certain tribes and people that might not have as good of a lives as us humans do, but humans by and large have plenty of advocates already. I feel like it's animals that need the extra
Oh
advocates.
yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. I was not at all. Nobody mistake what I was saying with me advocating trophy hunting because I think it's disgusting. But,
No, I
it's
mean,
not
as far
necessarily.
as hunting in general, I think that's a very good thing. I mean, my
Yeah.
grandparents, they've got a house in Colorado, and Frank is this old timer who hunts his own venison and cooks
Mm,
it, eats every part of it. I think that's great. I think
mhm,
there's too much of a disconnect between the meat that people eat and what actually has to happen for that animal to be served on the
mm,
plate. Like,
yeah.
personally, I do not think it would be going too far to say that every meat eater needs to kill an animal once just to
Yeah,
know,
a
and
big one, not like a squirrel or something small.
like a
Like you need
cow
to
or something.
understand what's happening.
And maybe you don't have to actually go out there and shoot it or slit its throat like you do in some of these coming of age like in Turkey, they have that ceremony where once you become a man, you slice a goat's neck. And
Uh-huh.
I think that actually does sort of teach you what really happens. But even if it was something as simple as, imagine if you had a smartphone and in order to be like a registered meat eater, you had to just once press a button and see an animal get killed that was directly the result of you pressing that button. I
Uh-huh.
mean, I think that would turn a lot of people into either vegetarians or just people who want to minimize suffering of animals.
Yeah. Have you seen anything about how much fish can suffer? I know crustaceans like scallops and mussels. I think there's clams tend not to, but I was curious if you've seen anything about how much fish can suffer. It's something I've been curious about because I believe they have a much less developed nervous system, which kind of implies they might not be able to experience as much pain, which that makes me feel a little better about eating fish.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you'd ever looked into that because
Yeah, I'm
I
not
hadn't,
sure,
so
although I
I
have
wasn't
read
sure.
Old Man in the Sea by Hemingway, and it was
Okay.
pretty tragic once that beautiful big fish with the shining scales gets killed, does its last death throes, and then turns the pallid white and loses all of its life. Think of some beautiful swordfish out there in the ocean swimming freely, and then it just gets killed. I mean, I think whenever we try to draw the line of saying, oh, these animals don't suffer, I think that's a bad place to go. I agree. I think it's true that as there are degrees to which animals can suffer, and I think fish probably can suffer to a lesser extent than a chimpanzee. But I also feel like all animals suffer. I think even to a large extent plants suffer. And if you carve your name into a tree, I don't think the tree likes that. And I don't think that's crazy to say that a tree has likes and dislikes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I would be curious to see in the future, what comes out about the consciousness of plants, because it's clear that they react to their environment. It's not just...
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's the famous experiment where if you have two different mason jars full of sprouts or rice or whatever, you put them in identical cabinets, but one of the cabinets you only say good things to. You say, yeah, plant, you're doing great. Sort of like the massages and Beethoven treatment. And then with the other cabinet, you just give it bad energy. You say, hate you, plant. You're a bad plant. I swear, this is a high school experiment that kids do all the time across America.
I've heard of it.
And the plant that has good vibes turns out to be a flourishing, wonderful plant, and the plant that had bad vibes gets stunted in its development. So, I mean, what more proof do you need that plants are conscious and take in the energy that's around them? And if it's true for plants, it's true for every animal out there, for sure.
Yeah, that would be really fun to do as an experiment. I wonder if there've been any like double-blind studies where it's like, I'm sure there could be like human bias that creeps up when you're yelling at these plants and like how much light, I don't know.
Yeah,
but it'd
be
really
a good
cool
experiment. Well, anyways, we urge anyone to do that experiment, although don't go too hard on that plant that's in the naughty cabinet, because plants have feelings too, and so do all animals. And
yeah. Have you looked at all into like cricket protein and stuff? That's one thing we haven't even touched on.
Yeah.
Is the fact that cricket protein is one of the most sustainable, like per ounce, most sustainable forms of protein that we can make.
Right.
Lab grown is probably going to blow that out of the water once it's economically viable, but...
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. I think if we don't adopt clean meat, then we are going to be eating crickets in the year 2100.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I totally agree.
Personally, I maybe it's a cultural thing. I can't get out of the grossness factor. I have once had a cricket in the form of a lollipop, and it was pretty gross.
Where was that?
That was at a national park. I think it was Yosemite.
Okay.
But it makes me think of Snowpiercer. Have you seen that movie?
No, I haven't.
So Snowpiercer is this movie where it's after the apocalypse. So it's after climate change has turned the entire world into a frozen tundra, and all that's left of humanity is on this train called Snowpiercer that goes around and around the earth really fast to generate its own heat.
I have heard it. Yep, I have seen it, actually.
And basically the whole human society is divided up by the carts of the train. So in the back cart of the train, it's the people that are the lowest levels of society, and all they eat are these protein bars that are nasty. And then you find out at the end that there were all the bugs were basically ground up into these protein bars. And as you go further to the front of the train, you have like much more luxurious things. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to have to eat crickets. I mean, I haven't given it a fair shot, so I don't want to rip on it, but I would much rather eat a lab grown sirloin steak than...
Oh yeah. Speaking of Snowpiercer, what do you think? I think we should get into like the worst case, best case, and most likely.
Oh yeah, okay.
What do you think about the worst case? I know you kind of mentioned that we may be eating crickets.
Well, I think the worst case is that some countries are hit so hard by the lack of food, but I think water is going to be actually bigger than food.
Maybe
So
more pressing at
more
least.
pressing. So I think we're going to see a lot of wars, especially in areas like the Middle East, where there's already so many disputes over who owns what river, and if you are along some river that, there are other countries that depend on that river, but because you're by the top of the river, you can pretty much do whatever the hell you want, and it's no
Mhm.
skin off your back. Other people are going to have dirtier water, less water, water that
Oh
has
yeah.
antibiotics. So I think we're going to see a lot of wars and disputes around water, and I think there are going to be some disputes around food, but I mean, just keeping it strictly to food, I think the worst case scenario is basically that we continue along the factory farming line and it only expands even further to feed the additional 4 billion or 3 billion people that are going
Uh,
to come around by 2050. So it creates much more suffering, and people aren't even really healthier because it still has all of the same issues. And I guess if we're talking actual worst case, like the worst possible case, even if it might not be
mhm.
as likely,
Yeah.
I think we could see a superbug as a result of this, and it could wipe out 2/3 of the world.
Yeah, I mean there's a lot of things that we aren't prepared for, and a superbug that's resistant to antibiotics and, you can't get vaccinated for, that's obviously
Yeah.
a problem. Yeah, I would say something very very similar to that. I mean, it's very easy to think of a worst case scenario when it comes to food and overpopulation and, the amount of suffering that can possibly take place when trying to feed all these people. Um, but if we were to talk about the best, or what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, let's go best case.
Yeah, because if we think about the best case, I think there are some positive trends right now too. Like there's a trend that everyone is, not everyone, but the fact that Whole Foods is a very popular store now, where it used to be like just this, only the rich people went to Whole Foods or only the rich people went to Trader Joe's. I mean, even Walmart now has huge organic sections. The market is reacting to customer demands, and that's what I love to see. I love to see when the public actually wants something that's good for society. And I think there's a lot of things going in terms of people wanting the healthiest food for themselves, which means they're going to start thinking on the next level, what is the most ethical? And then once this is economically viable to get very healthy, real food, then maybe the next step is the lab grown meats. And
Yeah.
we can have then, so if I were to just like give you a snapshot of the best case, it would be a bunch of lab grown meat, but it would be healthy, lab grown meat that has been tested and can compete with good, regular grass fed organic meat. Um, but I would also like to see a lot of vertical farms that kind of free up land to just be prairie land or to be forest, and let's like regrow some of our forests back and bring some
Yeah.
of our food production into cities. So one of the things that I hate about big food is the supply chain. You don't see most produce for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
And
Well, I
most
read one
so
stat that said if you get an apple from the supermarket, there's a good chance that apple is more than a year old since it's been picked off the tree. Because they
really, I didn't
basically,
know it was that bad.
oh yeah, it's bad. I mean, they basically freeze the apples, specifically because apples keep for a long time, and
Mhm.
then they'll just like thaw them out like right as they actually get to the supermarket. But it's not like you're eating something. I mean, unless it says like locally grown and in season,
Yeah.
it's probably very old.
Yeah, but if you have these vertical farms, your supply chain is so short. You can walk down to your farm and pick whatever you want, or just order, like instead of going to the grocery store for produce, maybe you go to a big warehouse, like the farm, quote unquote, where they go and pick your food for you right there and then.
Yeah.
And that would be such an awesome thing. You can just go to this farm that has all of your meat, all of your vegetables and your produce, and that's it. I mean, you can just do that and then you're done. And the supply chain, we don't need to waste a whole bunch of energy getting it from one place to another. And it'll be easier and cheaper for people to actually access, because the cost of all of that extra stuff to transport the food isn't priced into these different items of food.
Yeah, totally. So, you want to hear my best case?
Yeah.
So, have you heard of the Hardburger Park Land Bridge in San Antonio, Texas?
No.
So basically, this land bridge, so they realized that they were cutting off the transportation routes of animals by building these highways.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
I know what you're talking.
yeah, so we have highways all over America. And when you think about a highway, it's a death trap for any animal that's trying to live out its life in the wild. If you're a bear, you need a lot of area to be able to roam around. And by creating land bridges, these bears can still roam around from one forest to another without having to worry about getting hit by a car. So my future scenario, that's the best case scenario, would be extrapolating out this system to the furthest extent. So already with Elon Musk's Boring Company, he has made the case for transporting ourselves underground in three-dimensional space, many different levels below the ground, versus this two-dimensional highway system that we have today. So imagine if we took that even further, where there are no streets, no highways anywhere on the surface of the earth. Instead, it's like we're on the Garden of Eden, where there's land, there's animals roaming around, there's farms, there's amazing, cool office buildings and bungalow houses that have trees built into them, and waterfall features, and all the transportation happens underground. Maybe we still have like some skyscrapers that have gardens on top of them, and some
or
of this
green walls.
Green walls, vines coming up the sides, but that would be my utopia. That would be my best case scenario. And the animals that are on the surface of the earth, some of them can be protected like the national park systems. Some of them can be in hunting preserves where these animals live great, happy lives, and then they're eaten, which is more healthy than having animals that have suffered their whole lives. And then if you just want the cheapest possible, healthiest meat, then you get the lab-grown version.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, when you have a baby, I haven't had a baby, but this is what I hear, is that the first thing you do is you put up pictures of giraffes and elephants and lions all over the room. You have the nice little animals that dangle from the sky and they play with them. Why do we do this for babies? It's because we're introducing them to what else is here on Earth. We're saying, look, here we are, the animals and creatures of the world, and we're here to teach you about these animals and introduce you into all of the creatures that made it onto Noah's Ark. If you believe in that story, or even just like it for its own instructive purposes. And if we can go back to a system where we have these animals living freely around us, and it's not just a man and a dog on Mars struggling out for survival, but we actually keep some other animals around, that's the best case scenario.
Yeah, I mean, that was taken to the extreme, and I love every second of it. That sounds like an amazing world.
And then the most likely is definitely in the middle. I think the lab-grown meat is going to happen regardless, because I think the economics are going to prove that it's just the cheaper option, and it has other benefits. I don't think the land bridge, kumbaya scenario is as likely, although I also don't think it's impossible, and I think it may very well happen in at least certain areas of the world.
Yeah. That's kind of where I typically go with this, is some parts of the world are going to approximate our best case scenario. some parts of the world are going to approximate our worst case scenario. So if I were to say some countries I'm scared about being in the worst case scenario, India comes to mind because of overpopulation. Or if we're talking best case scenario, let's say Norway or New Zealand come to mind.
Oh yeah.
Where it's just, especially New Zealand, because it's an island, it doesn't have to deal with all of the crap that other countries are doing. You don't have to worry about who's upstream and putting something in your water. The only thing that really affects New Zealand is the ocean and, and climate and stuff. But ocean pollution is the big one. Ocean acidification, there's a lot of, there are a lot of things that still affect New Zealand.
We're all living on the same planet, so no one is totally safe, but if you are safer if you're situated where New Zealand is.
Yeah, or Switzerland is always a utopia type of country.
I think America too has we have more national parks than any other country.
I'm partially optimistic and partially pessimistic about the US. I would say that if I were to choose somewhere on the scale I would say we're a little on the positive side, but we have a lot of farmland that's Monsanto was developed here. The standard American diet is here. There's a lot of really bad things in terms of food and diet and agriculture in the US, but again, we see those positive trends, which I'm hoping are economically viable and can put these factory farms out of business, because I think they're disgusting. Did I tell you I saw one on the way back when I road trip back from LA?
No.
In Kansas, I saw one. It was terrible. It almost looked like there was a storm cloud overhead right when I passed it. It was just the worst vibe I ever got from, driving next to something on the highway.
Yeah, that's terrible. And then just to end it on a positive note, one other new development that does give me lots of optimism and hope. I don't know if you saw this, but Bill Gates just came out a week ago with his Breakthrough Energy Fund, where what he does, it's so brilliant because he's not saying what's going to happen, but he has a system for getting better, which is he lays out very clearly what the main contributors are to climate change, and then he highlights startups that are doing the best job at solving those those specific issues. So he's basically putting the spotlight on the startups that are doing the best job at solving the most important issues for climate change, and he's allowing investor money, private money, and some public money to be funneled into these companies so that they can have an amplified effect on how much good they can create in the world. So I have faith in the private sector more than the public sector, but overall, I have a lot of faith that humanity will at least figure out. Not everyone's going to be fine all of the time, but I think we are moving in a good direction, at least from what I've seen most recently.
Yeah. Oh, there's this one company started by Kimball Musk, Elon Musk's little brother, or maybe big brother. I don't know. His brother. But it's called Square Roots, where he's working with entrepreneurs, and they're basically trying to be startup farmers in urban areas. So it's basically repurposing these old shipping containers to be vertical farms, and it's kind of like a startup incubator for these urban farmers. So I thought that was kind of a cool company too. I know there's a lot of good trends.
Yeah.
I don't want to get. It's really depressing sometimes to think about factory farming.
Think about the status quo.
Yeah, it's just really. I think kind of like there's that human bias where the bad outweighs the good by 5-1. But if you really objectively sit back and think about it, like you said, there's a lot of positive things. So you're right. I am optimistic about the future of even the U.S.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end it.
We are all gathered
Yeah,
here
agreed.
today to talk
So
about
thank you
three
everyone for
very
listening.
important
This
things.
has been the future of
We're
food,
going to talk about what has happened,
and we hope to
what is
see you next
currently
time.
happening, and what will inevitably happen.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
Will attempt to stimulate the consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind the strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
It's possible. Future, 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 future.